What if I told you scientists discovered ancient DNA that doesn't match any known human species? Could this rewrite the story of human evolution? Or is it just another viral myth? Stay with me, because we're about to uncover the truth. 146,000 years ago in northeastern China, a man was alive. He stood probably around 5'10", and tall, heavier built than most modern men, with a face wider and flatter than ours, a brow ridge thick enough to cast a shadow over his eyes, cheekbones so broad they gave his face an almost rectangular geometry. His brain was roughly the same volume as yours. He thought, he hunted, he navigated a landscape of river valleys and forests that would be unrecognizable today. He was not one of us. He was not a Neanderthal. He was not any kind of human being that science had ever formally documented. And when he died, his skull settled into the sediment beside a river and began its impossibly long wait. For 100,000 years, the earth held him. For another 46,000 years beyond that, the world forgot he had existed. And then a laborer found him during bridge construction in the 1930s, understood immediately that he was holding something extraordinary. And instead of handing it over to the Japanese soldiers who were occupying the region at the time, wrapped the skull in cloth and dropped it down a well on his family's property where it stayed for most of a century, submerged in cold water in the dark at the bottom of a well. The world above it went through the Second World War, the Cold War, the Digital Revolution, the mapping of the human genome, and the discovery of an entirely new branch of the human family tree from a sliver of finger bone pulled out of a cave in Siberia. And then the man who had hidden it told his family where it was before he died. And the skull came back up. And what scientists did to it in 2025 and what those experiments revealed about who that man actually was has forced a revision to the human story so complete that every textbook diagram of human evolution currently in circulation is already out of date. Join us now as we go inside the discovery of the Dragon Man skull. Through the extraordinary molecular science that cracked open its identity after every conventional approach failed. Through what its face finally tells us about a species we had known for 15 years only as a ghost in the DNA of living people, and into the implications of what this find reveals about the full, tangled, far more extraordinary story of what human beings actually are. The story begins not with a skull, but with a finger bone. In 2010, a team of scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, published a paper that sent a shockwave through evolutionary biology from which the field has never fully recovered. They had been studying a fragment of bone pulled from a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a place called Denisova Cave. The fragment was not much to look at, a pinky finger bone, small, crumbling, easy to mistake for animal material rather than human. But when the scientists extracted ancient DNA from that fragment and began sequencing it, the result was incomprehensible at first glance. The genetic material matched neither modern humans nor Neanderthals. It matched nothing in the known record. What they were looking at was a completely new branch of the human family tree, an entire species of human beings, or at least something so close to a species that the distinction barely mattered, that had lived across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years without ever appearing in the fossil record in any form that anyone had recognized. The Denisovans, named after the cave where the first fragment was found, shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals and modern humans. The two groups had split from each other before both split from the line that led to Homo sapiens. Denisovans had interbred with our ancestors, and the genetic proof of that encounter is still visible today. Melanesians carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA. Aboriginal Australians carry it too. Filipino Negredo populations carry it. People across Southeast Asia and the Pacific carry measurable traces of this ancient species within themselves. Here is what made this discovery uniquely disturbing in a way that the discovery of Neanderthals had not been. With Neanderthals, science had had the bones for nearly 2 centuries before the DNA arrived. To confirm what they were, researchers knew what Neanderthals looked like. They had skulls, skeletons, entire individuals whose physical form could be studied, debated, reconstructed. With the Denisovans, the situation was precisely reversed. Science had the DNA before it had a single recognizable bone. Researchers could read fragments of the Denisovan genetic code, could determine that this population had spread across an entire continent, could prove that millions of living human beings carried their biological inheritance, and could not describe what a Denisovan individual had looked like. Not their face, not their skull shape, not the proportions of their body. The Denisovans were a species defined entirely by their absence, known through the hole they had, left in the genomes of the people who came after them, without a single complete bone that anyone had yet recognized as theirs. And then in 2018, a skull appeared. Actually, it had appeared 80 or 90 years earlier, but 2018 was when it reached the hands of researchers who had the technology to understand what they were holding. The Harbin cranium, nearly complete and dated to at least 146,000 years ago, was found near Harbin in northeastern China, most likely during bridge construction over the Se River in 1933. A Chinese laborer reportedly found it and hid it from the Japanese soldiers then occupying the region. He kept the secret for most of his life and eventually told his family where it was before he died. The skull was finally submitted to researchers in 2018. When scientists first set eyes on it, the reaction was a compound of wonder and disorientation. The skull was enormous. The cranium was massive, housing a brain volume roughly equivalent to that of a modern human being, indicating a level of cognitive capacity that matched our own. But the face was wide and flat, the brow ridge thick and projecting, the cheekbones enormous, the nasal opening broad. It was unlike any skull in the fossil record. In 2021, a team of Chinese researchers published a formal description of it, naming it Homo longi dragonman, and proposing it as an entirely new species, possibly the closest extinct relative of Homo sapiens ever found, closer even than the Neanderthals. That proposal ignited fierce scientific debate. The skull's features were strange enough that it could fit multiple interpretations, and the only way to resolve the argument definitively was to find out what the skull was still chemically holding after 146,000 years in the ground. Scientists needed DNA, and getting DNA from a skull that old from a warm and humid region of China was going to be one of the hardest technical challenges in the history of ancient genetics. Ancient DNA degrades relentlessly after death. Water breaks it down, bacteria break it down, heat accelerates the process. DNA that is 40,000 years old is considered difficult. DNA that is 100,000 years old is considered extremely rare to recover at all. The Dragonman's skull was at least 146,000 years old, placing it at the very outer limit of what the field had ever managed to retrieve from a hominin fossil anywhere. The team that took on this challenge was led by Jiai Fu, a geneticist at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, a researcher who had been involved in foundational Denisovan DNA studies, including the very first sequencing work from the Siberian cave. She and her team targeted 6 separate samples from the skull's most promising locations, including the petrous bone at the base of the skull, which is famous in the field for preserving DNA longer than almost anywhere else in the human skeleton. They worked in clean rooms using protocols designed to prevent even microscopic contamination. They extracted, processed, and weighted. The samples yielded no ancient DNA, the bone was simply too old, and the genetic material too degraded. At this point, many research teams would have published a negative result and moved on. The skull was extraordinary, but its molecular secrets seemed permanently locked behind 146,000 years of chemical decay. But Fu's team made a decision that ended up rewriting what ancient biomolecular science is capable of. They pivoted to an entirely different approach, one that had only recently emerged as a serious scientific tool. Instead of looking for DNA, they began looking for proteins. Ancient proteins survive far longer than ancient DNA. While DNA degrades over tens of thousands of years, proteins made of stable chains of amino acids can survive for millions. The field is called paleoproteomics, and it operates on a principle as elegant as it is powerful. Proteins carry biological information, encoded in a different molecular alphabet than DNA. But that information is still enough to reconstruct evolutionary relationships, to identify which branch of the family tree a specimen belongs to. With the same basic logic that DNA sequencing uses, from the same petrous bone samples that had yielded no DNA, Fu's team extracted and sequenced fragments of 95 different ancient proteins, more than had ever been recovered from any hominin fossil of that age anywhere in the world. When they compared those protein sequences to the known protein profiles of modern humans, Neanderthals, and the few known Denisovan samples, the result was unambiguous. The Dragonman skull was a Denisovan. But the team was not finished, because having recovered proteins, they turned their attention to something that no ancient genetic study of this age had ever successfully exploited before. The dental calculus, hardened plaque, the mineralized buildup that forms on teeth over a lifetime of eating. The same substance that dentists scrape off in their offices. The Dragonman would have gotten top marks from dentists. The team managed to scrape a mere 3 micron of calculus from its tooth. Nearly 4/5 of the human genetic material extracted from the sample came from modern contamination. But the remaining ancient human DNA matched mitochondrial DNA from previously sequenced Denisovan genomes, confirming Dragonman is a Denisovan. Fu said, "We can finally clearly show it is Denisovan DNA, and it is related to early Denisovan, 0. 3 micrograms, less than a grain of salt." from that almost impossibly small sample, scraped from the gum line of a man who died 146,000 years ago, scientists extracted the mitochondrial DNA that settled the 15-year question that had hung over the entire field of Denisovan research since the moment the fingerbone from Siberia first revealed their existence. The dragon man had a face, and the face was Denisovan. According to Chris Stringer, research leader in human origins at the Natural History Museum in London, the Harbin skull is the most complete Denisovan fossil ever identified. Combined with morphological analysis, the molecular work makes it increasingly likely that Harbin is the face of the Denisovan. What that face actually looks like is worth sitting with, because the Denisovan appearance has been one of the most tantalizing unknowns in all of human evolutionary science. The Harbin skull reveals a being with a prominent brow ridge, substantial and projecting, but not as extreme as some very ancient human ancestors. The brain cavity was large, comparable in volume to the brains of both modern humans and Neanderthals, indicating cognitive sophistication that the genetic evidence had already suggested. The face was wide, the upper jaw heavy, the nasal opening broad. There were features that were surprisingly contemporary in certain angles of the skull, a flatness to certain facial planes that did not look entirely alien. And there were features that were unmistakably archaic that marked this individual as something distinctly other than any population of Homo sapiens alive today. The overall impression that emerged from the Harbin skull was of a being that was deeply disturbingly familiar in some dimensions and unmistakably different in others. Something that would have made eye contact with you, something whose face would have registered as a face, and something you could not quite have placed as fully one of your own kind. The Denisovan DNA that persists in living populations today is not merely a genetic curiosity, it is functional. It has been preserved specifically because it conferred advantages that helped the people who inherited it survive in demanding environments. A holotype of the EPAS1 gene in modern Tibetans, which allows them to live at high elevations in a low oxygen environment, likely came from Denisovans. Over 80% of Tibetan populations carry this Denisovan inheritance, allowing them to thrive at altitudes above 4,000 meters, where unacclimated humans develop altitude sickness, blood clotting problems, and impaired cognitive function. The EPAS1 variant is found only in Tibetans at very low frequency in Han Chinese and in the Denisovan genome. It exists nowhere else in the human family. Modern humans did not wait for a new mutation to adapt to the Tibetan plateau. They acquired the adaptation by inheriting it from the species that had already spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving in high-altitude Asian environments. Think about what that means. Every Tibetan person alive today who can climb at altitude, who can sustain physical labor at 4,000 meters, who does not suffer the cardiovascular consequences that most humans face in that oxygen-thin environment, is doing so with biological machinery inherited from the Denisovans, from a species that we did not know existed until 2010, from a species whose face we could not describe until 2025. The Denisovan are not ancient history in any meaningful sense of the phrase. They are inside millions of living people right now, helping their hearts and lungs function in one of the most physiologically demanding environments on Earth, having crossed the species boundary at least 50,000 years ago and never left. Denisovan genes may have conferred a degree of immunity against specific pathogens. Denisovan introgression may have influenced the immune system of present Degouin, De Papans, and potentially favored variants to immune-related phenotypes and adaptations to local environments. Genes related to fat metabolism and sensory reception are more active in people with higher Denisovan ancestry. In August 2025, a study reported an archaic haplotype of the MUC19 gene of Denisovan origin, which occurs at high frequency in most admixed American populations. The Denisovans did not merely live alongside our ancestors. They became part of us in ways that are still shaping human biology in the 21st century. They contributed to our immune systems. They gave Tibetans the ability to breathe at altitude. They left metabolic adaptations in the populations of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. They influenced the sensory capabilities of people whose families never knew they existed. The relationship between Homo sapiens and the Denisovans was not a brief historical encounter. It was an ongoing biological merger that has been running in the genomes of their combined descendants for 50,000 years. Years, and is still producing measurable effects in living human populations today. Now, take the Dragon Man skull and its confirmed Denisovan identity and connect it to something else that happened in the same research period, because the Harbin skull is not the only fossil whose re-examination in 2025 has forced a radical rethinking of the Denisovan timeline. The Yunxian skulls, two partial craniums found in the bank of the Han River in central China over 30 years ago, badly crushed and impossible to study accurately until CT scanning and digital reconstruction technology caught up with them, have now been reanalyzed in the context of what the Dragon Man discovery established about Denisovan morphology. And the chronology they represent is not 146,000 years. It is approximately 1 million years. The human family tree, which the standard model placed with a common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens at somewhere around 5 to 800,000 years ago, may now need to be pushed back twice as far. Because if skulls with Denisovan morphological affinities were already present in China a million years ago, the split between our line and theirs did not happen when the DNA alone suggested. It happened deeper in a prehistory that extends further back than any model currently incorporated into mainstream paleoanthropology had accommodated. This matters for a reason that goes beyond the narrow question of Denisovan classification. It matters because it changes what the so-called muddle in the middle actually is. Paleontologists have a technical name for the period between roughly 700,000 and 126,000 years ago, the Middle Pliene. And the informal nickname they use for the fossil record from that era tells you everything about how confusing it has always been. They call it the muddle in the middle. Dozens of skulls from this period have been found across Africa, Europe, and Asia. They do not sort neatly into the categories of Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, and Denison that researchers hope to impose on them after the genetic discoveries. They're too variable, too intermediate, too many different kinds of strange. Scientists created informal classification categories to hold them, Homo heidelbergensis being the most frequently used dustbin label. But there has always been fierce debate about whether these groupings mean anything real or are simply a way of filing things that do not fit anywhere else. The Dragonman confirmation and the Jungian reanalysis suggest an answer. The muddle in the middle exists because the human family tree was far more complex and far more ancient than the model assumed. There were not 3 lineages diverging from a common ancestor around 500,000 years ago. There were at least that many, probably more, all tracing their ancestry back over 1,000,000 years, all living on the same planet at the same time, all occasionally crossing paths with each other, and sometimes crossing paths intimately enough to produce children who survived and reproduced and carried the biological inheritance of 2 different lineages simultaneously forward into the future. The complexity that paleoanthropologists were trying to sort into tidy categories was not a temporary historical confusion waiting to be resolved. It was the actual structure of human evolution. Messy, intertwined, populated by multiple overlapping populations that were simultaneously related to each other and distinct from each other in ways that no single clean branching diagram has ever adequately captured. The story of the Dragonman skull is ultimately a story about patience and about what is lost and found over time. A man found a skull on a riverbank in 1933 and understood instinctively that it was significant enough to protect. He kept that knowledge for most of his life, passed it on before he died, and eventually the skull reached people who had the tools to read what it was carrying. A geneticist scraped 0. 3 milligrams of hardened plaque from a tooth, worked in a clean room in Beijing, and extracted from that near nothing a mitochondrial sequence that answered a question that had been open since 2010. 95 proteins pulled from bone that had been in the ground for 146,000 years confirmed what the DNA suggested, and the face of a species that has been hiding inside the genomes of millions of living people for 50,000 years finally became visible. The Denisovans existed. They walked across a continent for hundreds of thousands of years. They built enough of a life to develop biological adaptations to altitude, to cold, to the specific disease environments of Southeast Asia. They encountered our ancestors and formed relationships intimate and sustained enough to leave a permanent biological inheritance that is still helping Tibetan people breathe, still shaping immune responses in the Pacific, still measurable in the MUC19 gene sequences of people in the Americas. And then they disappeared as a distinct population, absorbed or thinned out across the millennia, leaving behind only the molecular evidence of their existence, until a fragment of fingerbone in a Siberian cave gave them back to the scientific world in 2010. And a skull submerged in a well into northeastern China gave them back a face in 20 to 25. That face is wide and heavy-browed and large and deeply familiar in the specific, unsettling way of something that is very nearly kin. And because of what it implies about the depth of the human family tree, about the complexity of the evolutionary web that produced every person alive today, the story of who we are has just gotten a great deal bigger, a great deal stranger, and a great deal more honest than the clean diagrams in the textbooks have ever allowed. If this reshaped your understanding of what human beings actually are and where we actually came from, hit like and subscribe right now. The next investigation on your screen follows exactly where this one ends. Do not let the next discovery